They had left before the sun began to rise, and taken only what they would need and what would not be missed. If it were anyone else, Solaris would have ordered them hunted down and brought back for such an act. But this was bigger than him, bigger than any of them wanted to admit, and so he allowed them to go. He needed to focus on his own duty to the Empire of Eden now, and if questions came up, he would deal with them later. North Polaris would have aid, and gods above, below, and between would hear the battle cries of war on the winds as legions and forces gathered to answer the call to aid from the Empire of Eden. The road to the Empire was littered with the scars of battle and those who had not been so fortunate as to survive the travels between the cities. Those who could not reach shelter in time, and those who had been left to die either because they were too weak or too old to be of use. Some places were lucky, and had held out, waiting just until the caravans were on the move again to make haste to the bigger cities, bringing all that could be carried and putting themselves to work to help bring food or weapons to those in need. Other places were burnt out and left to fade away into memory. The convoy from the City of Birds met and merged into the convoy of their lands coming to the aid of the Empire, halting only long enough to allow refilling of canteens and to take a quick bite of food before marching on, following the road until the sky began to darken, the sun's light blocked out by thick black smoke and the suffocating smog. "We shall use magic to travel the rest of the way," Solaris stated. "We cannot risk an attack weakening our forces here." As the magic users gathered and prepared their spell, Vanessa scanned the horizon behind them. "Do you think they'll catch up in time?" she asked. "They'd better," Solaris said. "If you were anyone else, I might believe you actually didn't care," Cassian stated. Solaris said nothing more, and as the magic built around them and left the air shimmering in response, he sent a silent prayer that this would end well for all of them. The fight for North Polaris was already underway when Barnell and his company had arrived. Clearly, it had not gone well for the forces of the city. The Blessed had managed to break through their lines and now tore through the city's inner streets and homes, shattering runes and spells with seeming ease. Just as Barnell was about to command their force to attack, Eve raised a hand to halt him, and something dark and unearthly came down from the sky and charged upon the blessed forces. Mist-like creatures, from what Barnell could see from their distance, tearing into the forces of the blessed with ease. A vicious laughter began to echo around the sky as a ghost-like woman came down from the heavens, her eyes black as night and her hair white as snow. Then, like a wave from the ocean, a foreign group slammed into the blessed forces from beneath the ground, cutting their retreat off with a battle cry Barnell hadn't heard before, and like a well-practiced unit, the newcomers cut down the blessed ranks, leaving none alive. Within a matter of moments, only the North Polaris allies and the North Polaris forces remained. From amongst the newcomers, a large male drider stepped forwards on deceptively delicate legs, and upon spotting the Tiefling woman and the direwolf, he smiled and spread his arms wide while bowing in greeting. "Always a pleasure, Madame Ashbloom." "Marcus," Eve smiled, and slid off Iris's back to mimic the greeting bow. "I trust you brought everyone?" "All I could gather in one tunnel. I sent the main force on to Eden, as you requested with your mark," he nodded, then chuckled as a pair of cobalt males rushed forwards and clung to Eve's legs. "They have missed you." "Such darlings," she smiled, lightly petting the two males' heads. "You brought the goods?" she asked, as the two kobolds clung to her legs happily. And more is to come along, the Drider nodded with a smile. I couldn't very well fetch out the good stuff in the middle of a fight now, could I? Ahem. Evelyn smiled and turned to Barnell and Ashkin. Barnell, brother Ashkin, meet Marcus of Southern Ishtar, the best tunneler to be found and an old friend of mine. These two darlings, she smiled, and hugged the two cobalt males, both of whom were very happy for such affection, are Sniffles and Snaps, Marcus's pets. Boys, Marcus, this is Barnell of the City of Birds, and my eldest brother, Ashkin. Ah, the Master Ashbloom, Marcus nodded, offering both men a bow. I thought your letter said the City of Birds was remaining neutral, he asked. The main force of the City of Birds moves against the Blessed, towards the Empire while we came here, Barnell explained. Then when we are done here, we are to march and meet at Eden? Marcus asked. That's the plan, Eve nodded, and the two cobalt males returned to Marcus's feet. Who did you bring? I saw Shade bring down her mist ravens, so I know she's here. Your eyes are still very sharp, the ghostly woman said, and now she was closer. Barnell realized she was a Shadrakai, and the mists she'd used were in fact a collection of raven feathers that now hung from her shoulders as a scarf. Shade insisted on coming. As for the rest, Marcus smiled, and turned back to the men behind him. See for yourself, he offered, as four huge cloaked forms spread their arms wide and bent at their waist in greeting, showing their faces at last. Orcs, each one with a clan mark painted to their face to show their standing amongst the clans of Ishtar. Judging by the smile on Eve's face, Barnell could only guess that these four were more than just ordinary orcs. After moving into the ruined city of North Polaris and gathering those able to fight and sending the few brave families to the City of Birds with four huge direwolves to protect them, the company gathered at the edge of North Polaris to question how they would reach Eden swiftly. They could not use magic at this distance. It would take too much for their magic users and leave them vulnerable to an attack if they arrived in the middle of a battle. And they could not simply walk or run there. Allow me, Ashkin said, and turned to his sister with a smile, holding a small silver whistle. You brought Fuzzy? She asked, with a gleeful glint in her eyes. Fuzzy? Barnell asked. We need a creature that can dig through the stone and dry earth that will get us to Eden swiftly. Ashkin smiled, letting Eve take the whistle. And Fuzzy can dig us a way there without drawing attention. Who is Fuzzy? Shade questioned. Eve smiled and blew sharply into the whistle. At first, nothing happened. Then the ground began to shake and crack underfoot, sending Snaps and Sniffles rushing to Marcus's many legs to cling for them for stability, as something broke free from under the earth. Thick black fur hiding any face or feature as it turned towards Eve, showing a long snout and powerful claws. Eve spread her arms wide and fell against the furred mass, hugging what she could reach as the mass gave a low purring sound. Fuzzy, Barnell began to ask, is a giant mountain mole? Indeed, Ashkin nodded. Eve found him as a tiny baby when she was a child. Now he's all grown up, he mostly helps turn over and prepare lands for crops outside of Hell's Gate, though he still likes her more than anyone else. Well, Marcus smiled. We will be reaching Eden in record time, at least. Eve smiled, and after making sure everyone was clear on their part of the plan, Fuzzy began to dig down into the earth, making a tunnel big enough for the entire company to pass through, without causing any disturbance upon the surface. Once the entire company was inside the tunnel, the two kobold males began to bring the back of the tunnel down behind them to prevent an assault or ambush that may follow them. Fuzzy only ever paused long enough to allow Marcus to listen to the earth around them, letting them map their location and change direction if needed, until at last the earth became hard underfoot, and Fuzzy began to slow down in his tunneling due to the harsher earth his claws were now trying to move through without causing a permanent collapse. It took maybe half an hour before Marcus began to feel something on the earth above him and slowed the group down. "There are many soulless things above us, Madame Ashbloom," he said grimly, the fine hair upon his spider-like body standing on end. "Many more than they sent to Ishtar, and more than I have ever heard of being in one place before." "Afraid, are you, Marcus?" one of the orcs asked. "Not afraid. But this will be a tale to tell, if we all live through it," Marcus said, a strange smile upon his face. "Still, will 4 of you be enough?" he asked. "1 for simplicity, 2 for troublesome fools, 3 to entertain, 4 to slaughter. Any more of us would mean we would take this land as our own," the orc recited with a smile, as Barnell looked back at them. "We are a legion, trained to overthrow and conquer the lands we walk upon. Our masters ordered our response to the young lady Ashbloom because she won his favor. 4 of us is his promise that we will leave when the battle is done." "What did she do to win an orc's favor?" Barnell asked. "That is not our business to know," the orc stated. "But I do know that the Ashbloom name is blessed by the Ishtar masters because of her deeds." "Seems there's a lot about Evelyn we don't know," Barnell said with a small smile. "Is that not what makes her so enticing?" Marcus asked, with a glance at the Tiefling woman. "Beautiful as she is, she's not my type," Barnell said. "Besides, I'm paying her to help the City of Birds. Business is never good when mixed with pleasure." "And that is why I like you, Barnell," Eve smiled back at them. "And you still owe me 6 gold coins before we even begin anything close to talking about a date, Marcus." "Madame Ashbloom has good ears," Sniffles stated while Snaps nodded eagerly. Both sat on the ground gnawing on a small bone now they had been given a small reprieve. "Hush now, boys." Marcus hushed softly. They continued on for another half an hour, until Fuzzy gave a huff. Unable to get through the rock before him, he turned and pushed his nose against Eve's body, whining softly. "Hush, hush, it's okay. You got us this far," she assured softly, as Sniffs and Snapples came forward, sniffing and scratching at the rock wall before them, then shaking their heads. "Is bedrock. Can't dig through that. Not even kobold dig through that," Snap said, shaking his head. "Are we close enough to Eden to use magic?" Ashken asked, looking at the maps with Barnell. "We must be close by now." "We are close," Barnell nodded, reaching into his pack. "But the ground here is blessed and enchanted by ancient magic. We won't be able to use magic to get into the Empire, only to its outer walls." "Wait," Marcus said, the hair on his body shaking violently as the ground above them began to rumble. The Empire of Eden was overwhelmed by the sheer number of blessed forces coming at their walls. Blood had stained the great structures. The ancient trees were ablaze, and smoke choked the air as screams and cries echoed through the battling forces. Solaris caught the swift steps of his kin and other elven warriors as they cut through the twisted and broken corpses of the blessed forces. the burn and pull of elven magic against his skin, as Vanessa and others gifted with magic did what they could to heal and protect those without, while still remaining in focus to fight their own battles. Cassian and several other Dragonborn were in the thick of the battle, their near feral roar shaking the bones of the corpses enough to stun them for the briefest of moments, to allow for killing blows. The snakes had arrived only moments before they had, shattering a path into the Empire only to be met with the fangs and claws of Eden's mighty chimeras and manticores. The battle, however, was not easily won simply by the addition of such beasts. The Blessed had come with their forces at their most powerful, it seemed. Magic lashed against the walls, causing a choked atmosphere around the entire Empire. The attack was coming from all sides, and it was clear that even with the additional forces of their neighboring cities, the Empire was struggling. Vanessa's scream was enough to force Solaris to twist and cut through the arrow that had been meant to take his life, finding the shooter already dead, with Vanessa's staff through their back and stomach. "Report," he said firmly, as they stood back to back with one another, surrounded by magic as they burnt through the husks and corpses that were trying to charge at them. "We're struggling. Badly. Whatever forces they brought with them is just too much. There are too many of them for all of us. Even with the Empire's finest, we are struggling," she reported. "We need help, Solaris, and we need it now." A booming magic erupted not far from them, and Solaris pulled Vanessa out of the way as flames surged at them, only for those flames to be smacked skywards by another magic user, a cleric Solaris had seen from the walls of Eden. "Fall back to the walls!" the cleric yelled over the fighting. "We're pulling back!" Solaris nodded, heaving Vanessa up and guiding her as best he could towards the walls, only for the air to be torn by a bellowing roar of advancing foes. A mass of black limbs and bloody corpses, as the fallen dead were ripped from the ground and forced to stand against those they had died fighting beside. "Oh no," Vanessa said, seeing the incoming forces and knowing, just by the size of that force, that they would break through the walls again, and this time there would be nothing to stop them taking the Empire. A second horn crept over the battlefield, an echoing, haunting tone of a land that heralded death. Then, from the skies, 12 ghostly women, their arms spread wide and their eyes burning with unearthly power, came down, and from their bodies 12 mist ravens swept down on silent wings into the blessed forces, and ripped the dead and lingering souls away with ease. Then, from the earth just below Eden's walls, hordes of goblins, kobolds, and driders erupted and charged at the living blessed forces, who struggled to remain standing as more kobolds dug from their hiding places beneath their forces. Quinn snarled from his place and tried to move away, only to be grabbed in tight webbing and slammed to the ground as 2 kobold males snarled and snapped at his face. A male drider stood over him, with a deceptively sweet smile upon his face. "I will give you one chance," he said. "Where is the master of your forces?" "Why should I tell a dishonored bastard of my master?" Quinn asked. "You had your chance," the male stated, and stepped aside as Shade stepped forwards, her eyes burning with the same power as those in the sky. "He's all yours, ma'am," Marcus smiled. Quinn's face paled when he realized what he was facing, but his words were lost as Shade grabbed his face with her hand and forced him to look at her. Barnell unleashed his full force upon the blessed mages, tearing heads from shoulders, arms from torsos, and torsos from waists. Twin blades swept through throats and punctured chests with swift, well-timed strikes, while an axe and knife finished those lucky few who remained on their feet. Fangs and claws ripped through armor and crushed limbs, leaving openings and gaps for smaller teeth and claws, until the blessed forces realized they were beaten and tried to retreat, only to meet 4 orcs, their cloaks lost to the winds to show who they were. "Gatekeepers of Ishtar's dead well?" Vanessa breathed in awe and fear. "How in all the worlds and heavens did Evelyn gain favor from them?" Solaris could only watch as the 4 orcs slaughtered the retreating forces with ease and effortless strikes, until there were no blessed left. Then the largest of the 4 lifted his left arm and let out a victorious cheer that was taken up quickly by the other Ishtaran forces, making the people of the Empire shake and tremble in fear, as they wondered if the Ishtar forces were there to help, or if they were going to use this clear weakened state to claim the Empire as their own. In a clear show of who they stood for, the 4 orcs went down to one knee and bowed their heads to Evelyn, the sign of submission of the Ishtar slaves to their masters. Several hours later, Solaris and Vanessa were stood with a small company of 6 guards at the gates of the Empire of Eden, watching a group of 5 persons approach the Empire's still damaged walls. When the company was closer, Solaris realized that 2 small kobold were in fact riding upon the back of the Drider male at Evelyn's right, holding a mass of webbing between them. Barnell was sporting a bandage on his right arm, proof that not all had gone well. "Where is Quinn?" Solaris asked. "Webbed up," Barnell stated, nodding to the massive webbing the kobold males were holding. "He might not be as mentally there as he was before, but that's his own fault. He has done many wrongs to you and Vanessa, thus it was not my place to decide how he dies," Evelyn stated. "Unless you wanted him eaten alive." "As long as it's painful, I don't care how he dies," Solaris stated, and Vanessa could only shake her head. "Has he given you anything we can use?" "Shade," Eve began, nodding to the Shadrakai behind her, "has ripped all she could find in him about the Blessed, the Black Hood, and his plans. Beyond that, he has nothing but utter madness and stupidity to drive him." "We should discuss this inside," one of the guards said. "As you wish," Evelyn said. They were led into the Empire. Despite the obvious stench of death and decay that lingered in the air from the battle, and the extensive damage to the streets and buildings, the grandeur and royalty of the Empire was still obvious and clear.
"Such shiny things. Is no one worried it'd get dirty outside?"
Snaps asked in childish awe and wonder as he peered at the great buildings around him. "The Empire is rich, little one. It can afford to redecorate itself many times over in the year. These shiny, decorative places outside are just trinkets to them," Marcus explained. "They have never traveled outside of Ishtar, have they?" Vanessa asked. "Never," Marcus said, keeping his pace slow so as not to outpace the others of his group. "They were both runts, shunned by a pushy father from their birth clan. I took them in as mine after they stumbled into my webs while searching for warmth. They became somewhat beloved amongst the Drider tunnels of Ishtar, acting as messengers between those of the underground and those of the surface," Shade explained with a fond smile. "Even the masters of Ishtar are fond of them." The conversation died away as they approached a set of double doors, painted shining gold with silver handles. The guards split into 2 groups to push the huge doors open. leaving Solaris and Vanessa to lead them into the chamber beyond, and to the rulers of the Empire seated within. They were young ones, likely only a few brief years into their thrones, judging by the wide-eyed shock they looked upon the newcomers of their chamber with. They were not afraid, secure in the knowledge that they were in no danger. But still, it had been millions of years since anyone from Ishtar had set foot inside the Empire's walls, much less been granted an audience with the ruling emperor and his empress. For these two to witness the company of a Shadrakai, a Dryder, 2 kobolds, and an orc was likely an experience they would never forget, nor would they witness again within their lifetimes. Emperor, Empress, Solaris greeted with a deep, respectful bow. It is to these souls we owe our empire's safety, the Empress asked. Ishtar's gatekeepers, their Shadrakai, and their Dryders? Not us, the orc corrected. We came to aid our friend and comrade, the young lady Ashbloom, he explained and nodded to Evelyn. You are not of Ishtar? The Emperor asked in surprise. No, Your Majesty, Eve said. I am of Hell's Gate. I travel the lands for coin, and earned the aid of Ishtar some years ago. When I asked for their aid in this matter, it was given in the form you witnessed. How is it that you have become so beloved by Ishtar that they send 4 gatekeepers of their dead wells? The Empress asked. I have never heard of any such favor being granted before, not even by the old Ishtar masters. A story for another time, Evelyn assured. For now, I believe we have more pressing issues, she added, nodding to the lump of webbing on Marcus's back. I was unaware of any wishes you and yours may have had for dealing with this one. As Solaris and Vanessa do not want him, I wonder if you would mind the kobold clans having his body as a meal once we are done here. The 2 rulers looked between themselves, then shook their heads. We have no objections, the Empress assured. What can you tell us of this Black Hood and his blessed forces? The Emperor questioned. I personally can tell you nothing, but Shade can tell you what she knows, Evelyn said, and stepped back as the Shadrakai woman stepped forward. The Black Hood has not trusted this one with their face or their true name, but they have gifted him the means to attack the City of Birds, then lead the attack upon the Empire. As you can see, this attempt has failed. Thus, the Black Hood has removed whatever power was once given to this fool as a means to try and avoid further losses in this endeavor, the ghostly woman explained. He has some information on the Black Hood's plans, but beyond this, he is worthless. Then his efforts were for naught? The Emperor asked. Indeed, Shade nodded. Then why did he do all this? Knowing his failure would result in his abandonment, surely even an insane mind would know that the risks were not worth the efforts, the Empress questioned worriedly. Is there something we do not know? Something we are missing? Neither he nor the Black Hood could have known they would face the Lady Ashbloom and the lengths she would go to see them destroyed for their crimes against the dead and resting of this world, Marcus remarked. If they had known, they would have likely planned better and been ready for the arrival of at least one gatekeeper. Instead, they were only prepared to do battle against the Empire's forces and its allies. Nothing they could have done today could have prevented our forces tearing them apart. The Black Hood has suffered a great loss as a result, and he will need time to properly recalculate his actions. Where is the Black Hood now? Solaris questioned. We had reports of him being here at the Empire. Shade shook her head. This one has no answer. But there is no way that the Black Hood could have chosen to remain so close to a failed takeover. Not when there are Ishtaran forces in the area, especially when they failed to claim any of Ishtar's land for themselves in the past. Likely he has gone into hiding at a distance. Is there anything we can do to protect our empire and our people from this again? The Empress asked. We cannot simply demand that you stay here as our defense. You need only rebuild your walls and replace the runes and spells that protect your great empire, the orc said at last. The Black Hood has insulted our rulers once, and now he dares to continue to torment and harass the dead and resting of this land. An insult to the Lady Ashbloom. That alone is reason for my kin and I to hunt him down and drag him to the pits of Ishtar for proper punishment. Or, if he makes it harder for himself, we shall kill him where he stands. And what is it you ask in return? Solaris asked. That deal is between the Ishtar Masters and the Lady Ashbloom, the orc said with a nod to Evelyn. She called us to your aid, thus she will be the one who pays for our services when this is done. And until the Black Hood is found and dealt with, the Ishtar Masters will not give me a price, the Tiefling woman explained. To ensure that they ask for a fair price? Solaris questioned. Nothing in life is free, Shade reminded softly. But you need not worry for the Lady Ashbloom. She is beloved by the Masters of Ishtar and many others of our land. She won't be paying too big a price for our aid. The Masters are not so cruel. Now, is there nothing more you wish to ask? She asked, redirecting the matter, making it clear that whatever stood between Evelyn and the Ishtar Masters was not going to be spoken of to outsiders of the Ishtar lands. Hours passed slowly, and by the time the meeting ended, the moon was already halfway across the night sky, painting the land in its silver light. The flickering fires of the Ishtar camp were seen through the fog only by those who knew where to look. Solaris arrived at the camp to hear the music of a flute floating through the air, and after he rounded a tent on silent steps so as not to startle anyone, he saw Marcus gently blowing through the flute as he rested himself near a fire pit. The two kobolds were curled up under a blanket at his side with Evelyn, sleepily gnawing on a bone between themselves, while Evelyn leant with her back against Iris's side, a book in her hand, seemingly forgotten as her eyes were closed, apparently swept off to sleep by Marcus's music. Seeming to realize at last that his audience was sleeping, the Drider finished his tune with a soft chuckle, gently pried the book from Evelyn's hands, closing it with a small feather to mark the page, and retrieved a second blanket from a pack nearby, which he then placed over the Tiefling woman, before adding more wood to the campfire. Then he turned his gaze to Solaris. Did you need something, or are you just trying to figure out where the song comes from? He asked. I came to see if any further aid was needed in planning, Solaris admitted. I doubt it, Marcus said. Ishtar's forces are already hunting the blessed and slaughtering them with the promise of greatness that will come from their success as allies to the Lady Ashbloom. Then, when all of the blessed are dead, they shall rebuild what the blessed have ruined. Every house shall be made new, every wall remade, and all traces of the blessed and Black Hood removed from this land. Then, by order of the Masters, we shall return to Ishtar's shores. You make it sound so easy, Solaris said. It is that easy, Marcus smiled. You saw for yourself what we can do, and we are bound by the laws of our masters to serve and aid the Lady Ashbloom. It is her will that drives our forces while we are here. And as you are her friend, so too are you ours. Are you just friends? Solaris asked. I have not seen her allow anyone as close to her as you are. I may enjoy the woman's company and her beauty, but I am first and foremost a gentleman. Marcus laughed. I don't deny she is dear to me, but the same can be said of Shade. I make no secret of my fondness for them both, but it will be by their choice if it becomes more than simple friendship. How did you become a Drider? Solaris questioned. You do not seem the type to have broken the laws. A misguided and harsh mistake on the part of the court that judged me. One that they have since paid for in full and with interest, Marcus assured. I was accused of attempting to seduce and claim the heart of a high lady. Then, after my judgment and punishment, it was found that the same high lady was simply using the courts of our people to gain more power and land for herself, to try and earn the hearts of our queen. She was stripped of her power and title, then cast to the pit. But, as I am sure you are aware, the punishments of the innocents can never be undone. Thus, I remain a Drider, and many of my fellow innocents remain entombed in stone or lost in purgatory, he explained. And you can live with such a punishment? Solaris asked, even though you are innocent of a crime? My dear friend, the life of a Drider is not as hard as they make it out to be once you get used to it, Marcus stated, then nodded to a tent further down the pathway. Your friends are in there. If you feel you can help, then by all means. Solaris nodded after a moment and made his way to the tent.
Well, that wasn't the ending anybody expected.
For 6 days, we were busy slaughtering what remained of the Blessed's forces in the area around the Empire, searching for the Black Hood. And after a whole night of meditation with Shade and her sisters, we finally find where he's hiding. We go into this great tomb, expecting a fight, and instead we find a bloody altar with the Black Hood laid across it like some offering. According to Marcus, it had been there for the 6 days we'd been busy slaughtering and searching. From what we found in that tomb, it seemed that Quinn was the main attempt to claim the Empire of Eden. And when that failed, the Black Hood chose to end his own life as a way of maintaining some image of grandeur to himself. At least, that's what we could figure from the papers he left behind. We were about to burn them and the entire tomb out as a means of cleansing the land, when Snap said he found something that didn't look like the same handwriting. When we looked closer, we realized what was happening and kept those documents. The rest were burned. Not even an hour after we get back to the Empire, there's a second attack, launched from within. An assassination attempt on the Emperor and his wife. The only reason it backfired was because Shade was there. All of this, the Black Hood, the Blessed, the old Runation Empire, all of it was the work of a former minister of the court of the Empire. He was displeased that the new emperor and his wife were taking the advice of younger ministers rather than him, so he plotted this whole affair to try and expose the emperor and his wife as poor rulers so that they would be dethroned. Apparently, my involvement was the key force that stopped all of it. Not that I mind. I actually like this new emperor and his empress. But for all the death and pain that one foolish old minister caused, the entire empire has turned on him and his family. They are going to have everything stripped from them, even though it will barely cover the costs of the damages he's done. All of this just to dethrone someone? It is utter madness. It wasn't what we expected. But it does mean that the masters of Ishtar can't ask too much of me in return for calling for their aid. At least not this time. Speaking of Ishtar, I'm on a boat heading there right now with the forces they sent. Thankfully, they waited until I'd had chance to see my pa and brothers and make sure my affairs here are in order before they requested I returned. Hell's Gate, the town of Hollythorn, and all other cities and towns that were ruined by this whole affair are being rebuilt as new. The Empire is footing the bill. I guess this was the kick in the ass the Empire needed to realize just how lax they've become over the years. Solaris has the funding and the permission he needs now to start training a real defense force for the land again. Barnell and Cassian have been promoted to lords, and Vanessa has become a high lady. As for me, I'm happy to have good food and some more recognition for my family. We were known for what my ma did, but now there is another reason for people to know the family name. Evelyn sighed as she sat beside Iris in her small cabin aboard the great ship bound for Ishtar, looking over the words of her page as she dipped the needle point in ink and began to write again. Barnell was kind enough to pay me more than enough gold and silver for what I had done. It's enough for me to live off of for a good long while, assuming the Ishtar masters don't take all of it as part of the payment for what I owe them, since I borrowed Marcus 12 of their Shadrakai and 4 of their gatekeepers. Given the other outcomes we could have had, I guess this wasn't so bad. I got to have good food, killed people who needed to be killed, saw my pa and brothers, got paid, and to top it all off, I didn't get drunk. First time in 6 years I've had an adventure and I've not spent a night drunk. Marcus promised to make one of his specialty dishes today, so I'm gonna leave this here and get myself to the kitchen before all the food's gone. Until next time.